Very good evening to all of you. I welcome you all to the ICANN initiative, the Hindu and Indian Express analysis. So today, as we had discussed last week, that we'll be starting with a motivational story or quotations from this week. So let's start with the same. Today we'll be discussing the motivational story of the day, in which we'll be talking about Dr. Jonas Salk. So this story of Jonas Salk came up in today's newspaper itself, where it was about the accessibility of COVID vaccine whenever the vaccine is going to come into picture. So whether only the few rich people are going to have access to the vaccine, or will it be available to everybody? So is that going to be accessible and affordable to even the poorest of the poor? So the article was basically about that, but there was a small piece of information about Jonas Salk there, which really inspired me a lot. So he was basically a virologist, and he was one of the first people who formulated a vaccine for the polio virus, and that was first approved to be used over the people at large. So that was the vaccine that was approved for the general population to be used. So when he was asked whether he wanted to patent that vaccine, he refused it. So when he was asked when he was asked who owns the patent for this particular vaccine, then he answered to the journalist saying that, well, it is the people, I would say. So this is what he said. So he told that there is no patent, and he asked, could you patent the sun? So this shows how he was such a person with tremendous knowledge that he formulated a vaccine for a deadly virus, but then he refused to patent it. First of all, this shows the power that knowledge has, that power that intelligence has, that he could use his knowledge. See, often knowledge is a double-edged sword. So it could either be used to make such vaccines which can kill a deadly virus and save a lot of lives, but on the other hand, it could also be used to make nuclear bombs and weapons. So this shows how knowledge could be used to make something that is very useful for the larger mankind as a whole. So the second, it also shows the empathy and the compassion of this person who refused to patent his knowledge, who refused to patent this particular vaccine for the polio virus. So this shows how much he was concerned about the entire mankind, and that if this vaccine is patented, it may not really reach the poor people, and it might just be the rich people who could afford to buy the vaccine. So patenting the vaccine could have made the vaccine more unaffordable to the larger part of the mankind who are really poor. So this shows how empathetic and compassionate he was towards the mankind, towards the humanity, that such things which are going to save the lives of lakhs of thousands of people will have to be made available freely. Third, it also shows that the happiness that we derive from that self-satisfaction that we get out of helping others. So this is what he also truly believed in. He could have gotten patent, he could have gotten a lot of money for his vaccine, but then for him, that self-satisfaction that he derives when the vaccine that he has discovered is used by lakhs of people, and how their lives are saved, how the families are saved, that is much, much more important than the happiness he would have received out of the money from the patent that he would have got, or all the other materialistic benefits. So he chose satisfaction by helping others that he gets over the happiness that he can derive from the materialistic things and from monetary gains. So this is what eventually matters in life, and this is a huge source of inspiration for me also, and it should be for you also, because you all are again aspiring to be civil servants, where it is not the monetary benefits that are going to attract us to this service, but it is it's the larger motto of serving the people, of being of help to the people who are in need. So that is what should precisely motivate us. So with this, let's start with the topics of the day. So let's start with the first topic of the day. First, we'll be talking about international organizations. In fact, in your GS paper too, you have a topic called as international organizations, treaties, conventions, the whole UN system and all that. So as a part of this, we'll be looking into the functioning of, or what has been the achievements of, the World Food Program. So World Food Program, let us first of all see why is it in news, and precisely the reason why we have to read about it. So first, why is the World Food Program is in news? Because now this has bagged the Nobel Peace Prize. So that is why World Food Program WFP becomes very important for us, and there is a very good chance that you may have a question on this. So let's now first of all understand what is the basic objective of the World Food Program. So this is a program under the United Nations system itself, though it was started as an independent program, but then it came soon under the United Nations system. So its basic objective is to tackle the food shortages that various countries in the world are facing, and also to combat hunger, combating hunger in areas which are struck by conflicts and disasters. So these are the main focus areas of the World Food Program, is to tackle the food shortages across various countries in the world, and also to combat hunger, particularly in those areas which have been affected by disasters or they are conflict ridden countries. So this is where the focus of the World Food Program lies. So now let us come to discussing the importance of the World Food Program in combating hunger. So first thing is that already the number of undernourished, malnourished population across the globe is already high, and in the previous ICANN videos we already have discussed the data related to the number of malnourished across the globe. So this pandemic has only made this more worse. In the last class itself, we saw how the pandemic might push another 88 to 115 million people into extreme poverty, out of which 85% of the extreme poor are going to be in the middle income countries. So this pandemic is going to make this problem of food insecurity and malnourishment across the world even more severe. So therefore, in the scenario of the pandemic, the work or the role of the World Food Program becomes all the more important. Second is in the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. So we have a set of targets which are to be achieved by 2030, and then the Sustainable Development Goal 2 talks about zero hunger. So the zero hunger is to be achieved by 2030. So in this as well, the World Food Program has got a very important role to play. The third is, according to the World Food Program's data, the WFP's its own data shows that 690 million people across the world are hungry. So out of this, 60% of those people, of the 60% of the 690 million people who are hungry, live in countries which are affected by conflict. So this data again shows the importance of the World Food Program and what role it can play in combating hunger across the world. So this is the importance of WFP. Next, just for you to understand the basics, this was formulated in 1961 when the United States President of that time, Eisenhower, had suggested that such a program has to be formulated where food aid can be given through the United Nations system. So that is how it was formed in 1961. It is headquartered in Rome, Italy. So this is the basics of WFP. So next, you may have questions on World Food Program, which was recently in news because it received the Nobel Peace Prize. So discuss critically its achievements. So we will have to know about the achievements that the World Food Program has done since it has been set up, and also what has been the role of World Food Program in India. So first, let's look at the international achievements of the World Food Program. So soon after the World Food Program was born, in northern Iran there was an earthquake. So because of which nearly 12,000 people had died, and also several people were displaced because of the earthquake. So during this time, the World Food Program sent tons of wheat, sugar and tea to this area, and then helped the food crisis from occurring there. So this is the first thing that soon after the World Food Program was set up, within a few months this happened, and how it provided food aid to northern Iraq is very noteworthy. Next, the World Food Program also started the school meal project. This was started in Togo. So this was very important to keep the children away from malnutrition and provide them nutritious meal, and also a motivation and an incentive for the children to go to school. So it started with a school meal project in Togo. And then after South Korea and North Korea war happened, so that time also South Korea was facing a lot of crisis, especially related to the food crisis. So even that time, the World Food Program had supported post-war South Korea by rushing in the food aid there. So then genocide happened in Cambodia and Rwanda. So after the genocide, again World Food Program was there to supply with all the various food essentials into these two countries. Then in Syria alone, because of the conflict that is happening in Syria, nearly 4.6 million people in Syria are completely dependent on the food aid. So in Syria itself, also the World Food Program has played a very important role. Even in Yemen, which is also in crisis, WFP has played an important role in giving the food aid and combating hunger. So all of these examples you can quote to show the achievements of WFP over the years, how it has helped particularly the conflict-ridden countries where there are conflicts and strifes that are happening, and those countries that are struck with disasters, how the WFP has been very helpful to them. So through these examples you can quote the achievements. Later on, let's understand how has the WFP cooperated in India. So in India, first is with WFP, we have undertaken several public distribution system reforms. So particularly it helped us in translating or transforming into the targeted public distribution system, that is a TPDS, where there was more focus on efficient delivery and more decentralized distribution. So the PDS reforms, the WFP has played its role in India. Second, also the WFP has been instrumental in giving this innovation of Annapurti to India. So what is Annapurti? It's basically like an ATM, which is not dispensing cash but is rather dispensing rice. So rice or any other grain, for example. So it is a grain dispensing machine. It's an automatic grain dispensing machine. So this was basically installed to check the malpractices that may happen in the actual distribution of these grains. So that is why these grain ATM machines were introduced, and this was an innovative initiative that the WFP took up in India. Also, food fortification is another area where WFP has been playing its role in India. It has always stressed on fortified food to be given especially to women and children, so that they don't suffer from any malnourishment or micronutrient deficiency. So as far as food fortification is concerned, fortified rice was in fact distributed to nearly 3 lakh children in Varanasi under a pilot project. So these examples you can quote for WFP's cooperation with India and what role WFP has played in India. So connecting with India is also very important in your answers. So this will make a complete answer about what WFP is, how it was initiated, born, when it was born, what was its objective, what is the importance of WFP in the current day scenario, and what has been the achievements of WFP and what has been its role in India. So this makes it a complete answer. Now let's move on to the next topic. The next topic we'll be discussing is the Right to Information Act. So right to information also comes under your broader topic of transparency and accountability in your GS2 paper, and any act and its implementation issues is again a part of your GS2 syllabus. So in either of the topics you may find a question on RTI. At the same time, why is this topic important for this year is because it has been 15 years that the RTI has now been in action, and RTI has been implemented now for 15 years. So that makes it a very good time period for us to analyze the act, and also UPSC has been asking questions based on anniversaries or some certain years of implementation of an act. So that is why RTI this year and the issues associated with the implementation of this act becomes very important. So in one of the previous ICANN videos, we have already discussed in detail the RTI Act and the issues related to the implementation when we have been discussing the question and answers. So today we'll just have a look at a few more issues related to it and some important data that you may have to quote in your exam. So the first issue is related to the pendency. So definitely there are a lot of cases which are pending before the Central Information Commission and the State Information Commission. In fact, 2.2 lakh cases are pending before the Central and the State Information Commissions. So this shows that the pendency rate before the information commissions is very, very high. And this is based on a report card that was brought out by Satark Nagarik Sangathan and Center for Equity Studies. In such, whenever you are analyzing any government act, it's important for you to show some authentic source of data through which you are analyzing it. So here it is by Satark Nagarik Sangathan and Center for Equity Studies, which have brought out a report card on the implementation of the RTI in the last 15 years. So first is regarding the pendency of 2.2 lakh cases before the central and the state information commissions. So that is a matter of concern because 2.2 lakh cases is a huge pendency. And if we say that 2.2 lakh cases are pending, and this is not just the case with the central and the state information commissions, but the several states, it is very bad actually. The number of pendency is very high. From this report card, it has been shown that Maharashtra has the highest number of pendency with 59,000 cases pending before it. And if you look at the number of cases pending before these commissions and the current pace at which the commissions are disposing of the RTI requests, it would take Odisha nearly 7 years to dispose of the cases that are now pending before it. So this shows how much time it is going to take. Similarly, Central Information Commission is going to take 2 years from now to dispose of all the queries which are now pending before it, looking at the rate at which the requests are being disposed by these institutions. So this 2 years and then 7 years by the Odisha Commission points out that there is a huge delay involved in dispensing the cases if it is being done at the current rate. So this brings us to the third issue, that why is this rate of disposal very huge in spite of the pendency being too high. This is because the number of commissions, the number of capacity of these institutions is very poor. That is, the appointments are not being done timely. For instance, the Central Information Commission itself, that is the Chief Information Commissioner, has not been appointed since August. Since August this year, this position is lying vacant and nobody has been appointed to the position of the Chief Information Commissioner. And then if you look at the information commissions of the various states, you will see that many of these states are operating with very less capacity. If you look at the Right to Information Act, you know, it says clearly that the Information Commission shall comprise of a Chief Information Commissioner and not more than 10 Information Commissioners. So that is the strength of the Information Commission that has been given in the Act. But however, if you look at the various state commissions, the strength with which they are operating is very less. For example, in the case of Rajasthan, it is operating with just 3 commissions, and Odisha is operating with just 4 commissioners, and Jharkhand and Tripura are even more worst because they don't have any commissioners at all. So these bodies in Jharkhand and Tripura have become defunct and no commissioner has been appointed to these bodies. So in fact, even CIC, as we just discussed, after August, there has been no Chief Information Commissioner and one has not been appointed. So these information commissions are operating at a very reduced capacity because the appointments are not being done properly and on time. So because they have a reduced capacity, the pace or the rate at which they are disposing the cases is very slow. And this is amounting to not just the delay in the disposal of the current cases, but it is also leading to piling up of the new cases, and that is why there is a huge pendency of 2.2 lakh cases before the information commissions. The third issue is the culture of impunity. That is, even when these information commissions are not disposing of the cases, that time there is no penalty that is being levied on the concerned or the authorized person. So in an analysis that was done on 16 information commissions of various states in 2019 and 20, it was found that the penalties were imposed in just 2.2% of the cases. So even when the disposal was not according to the Act and penalty should have been levied on in such cases, only in 2.2% of the cases the penalty was levied. So this gives a feeling of impunity among the officials that even if they don't dispose of the RTI cases as per the law, even if they just reject it or no action is taken on the request, even if the requests are allowed to pile up, and keep them pending, there is no penalty that is being levied on these concerned officials. So they are not punished for violating the provisions of the act. So this creates a culture of impunity among them, that even if they violate the act, they are not going to be punished. So this is setting a very bad precedent, that everybody will think, these officials will think, that they don't have to do any duty, and even if they are not doing their duty, nobody is going to punish them. So this is setting a wrong precedent. These are the important issues. These three were the important issues, and the associated data that you have to remember that were given in this particular article. Also make a special mention of this study or the report card that has been brought up by the Satark Nagarik Sangathan and Center for Equity Studies. Mentioning the source of your data is very important. So this was the analysis that was given in this particular article about the implementation of the Right to Information Act. Now let's move on to the next topic. The next topic is the impact of climate change on flora and fauna. So this is a topic under your GS syllabus 1, which talks about climate change and how it has impacted the distribution of flora and fauna. So there was a study that was conducted by Zoological Survey of India, and this study was funded by the Ministry of Environment and Forest and Climate Change. So this study has now observed that many species of butterfly and moth that were inhabiting the Himalayas, they have now moved several meters upwards in their altitudes. So if this is the Himalayas, and if the moths and the butterflies were occupying this altitude, now many of these have moved at least 1000 meters to new altitudes. This is a proof of the existence of climate change and the fact that the lower altitudes are getting hotter and hotter, and that is why these species of butterfly and moth are finding this altitude inhospitable and inhabitable, and that is why they are moving to more upper terrains where the climate is more cooler. So this, for many of these species of butterfly and the moths who have moved to the upper altitudes, for most of them the difference between the newly occupied altitude and the previously occupied altitude is more than 1000 meters, that is more than 1 kilometer difference in the altitude. So this has been the impact of climate change on the fauna of this region in the Himalayas. So this example you can quote whenever you are talking about climate change and what kind of impact it has had on the distribution of fauna in the Himalayan region. So this study you can quote by the Zoological Survey of India, and you can talk about the observation related to the species of butterfly and moth. So such examples you have to collect more so that you can frame a good answer on what has been the impact of climate change on flora and fauna. So don't worry, as and when we keep reading the newspapers, we will come across many such examples, and you don't have to separately Google it or make a study about it. So that will be whatever we come across in the newspaper. If we consistently do it every day, that is going to be more than enough. So now let's move on to the next topic. The next topic we'll be discussing is about the police reforms. So police reforms, civil service reforms and all is a part of your GS2 syllabus. So about police reforms, what are the issues with the current functioning of the police, what police reforms are required, and examples of some of the good initiatives by the police. We have already seen that in the previous ICANN videos. We have even discussed a detailed question on police reforms in the previous ICANN videos. So in this particular article, again we'll be looking into few of the reforms which are required in the police. So first is the issues that we are facing in the police forces in India is the misuse of power or the excessive use of power. So if you look at the 2020 data, till now nearly 139 cases have been booked under the national security laws. So that is still now only. So 139 cases have been booked in under the national security laws. But however, out of these 139 cases, nearly 76 cases are regarding the cow slaughter, and 13 cases are regarding the anti-CAA protests, and only 37 cases have been booked for heinous crimes. So this shows how such stringent laws like the national security laws are actually being used for tackling some of the most common law and order issues in the country. So these laws, which are supposed to be restricted only for the issues concerning the national security, why? Because these laws are very, very stringent. they are now being used by the police to tackle some of the most commonly occurring law and order problems. So this data can show that, can exemplify that, can illustrate how these stringent laws are being used for not national security purposes, but rather for just maintaining the local law and order. So this shows the police has been using excessive power and has been invoking such stringent laws like the National Security Laws, the Public Safety Act, etc. Time and again, the Sedition Act, etc., the Sedition Section, etc., has been used by the police excessively. So this shows how there has been a misuse and abuse of power on the hands of the police. That there is excessive use of force by the police and there is misuse of power by the police. So this is one issue. The second is the encounter culture. So the recent example being the Vikas Dubey encounter case, and previously in the ICANN videos we have discussed how this encounter has actually led to a violation of the rule of law. So that again is a good example where you can show that there is this encounter culture where police wants to mete out instant justice. So this is the second issue. The third issue is the non-registration of the FIRs. There have been several cases where the police don't want to register the FIRs when people go to file them. So one reason is that maybe these FIRs are against the dominant caste of the region to which even the policeman may belong and they don't want to register it, or it may be against some powerful influential leaders and businessmen or politicians, so they don't register it, or it is maybe just because they want to show a low crime rate in their police station jurisdiction, so that is why they don't register the FIRs. So these are the common reasons why the non-registration of FIRs is happening. In fact, even the Supreme Court has told that wherever, if it is a cognizable offense, then there is no option for the police officer but to register the first information report. Even in 2003, when the Malimat Committee gave its recommendations, even the Malimat Committee stated that it has to be the duty of a police officer to register the FIR in case of cognizable offences. And if the police officer fails to register the FIR, then that should be made an offence and it must be punishable. So the police officer must be punished for not performing the duty of registering the FIR. In spite of the Malimat Committee recommendations and the Supreme Court judgment also telling the same, even today the non-registration of FIRs keep happening. So in this case, I remember watching Pink movie where she goes to the police station and then she wants to file an FIR, and then and then there was this concept of zero FIRs that came into picture. So where zero FIR is that you should be able to file your FIR in spite of despite the jurisdiction of the police station. So even if the crime happened in some other police station jurisdiction, but you can file your FIR in another jurisdiction, it is up to that police station to transfer the case to the relevant concerned jurisdiction, but you must not be denied that this is not the jurisdiction, so your FIR is not going to be registered. So this cannot happen. So this is a concept of zero FIRs. In fact, I remember using this even in one of the ethics case studies, that some case study was there where the police was not registering the FIR, so some big story, and then what would you do about it? So in such cases, if you know the concept of zero FIRs and if you know these little technical concepts, then that can be of great help in writing the case study. So I wrote that I am aware about the zero FIRs and it is the duty of the police officer to register the FIR. So like that you can quote such things even in your case studies. So this is about the issues that the police forces in India are facing. So now let's move on to the next topic. The last topic for today is regarding the role of regulators and the Competition Commission. So this is a part of your GS3 syllabus if you're talking in terms of the dominant position occupied by some of the players in the economy, some of the private players, the way they occupy dominant position in the market. So how to deal with that, then that is a part of your GS3 syllabus. And if you're talking about the regulators like the Competition Commission of India and how it is trying to prevent these players from misusing their dominant position in the market, then that is a part of your GS2 syllabus, which talks about the role of regulators and the role that they play in preventing such anti-competition measures taken by these private players. So now why we are talking about this is because there was a US House panel and this House panel had observed that many of these tech giants in the United States, starting from Google to Microsoft to Apple and Facebook, the US House panel held that these big players, these tech giants in the US, are abusing their dominant position in the market, and they are dictating unnecessary, unfair terms on their competitors and rivals and on their vendors, and they are abusing their dominant position in the market. So this report has come out by the US House panel. So that is why we are analyzing this issue and see if this scenario is same in India as well, and what has the Indian regulator done in that regard. So the first thing is, the issue is about the dominant position these tech companies have in the market. So Facebook has so many millions of people who are online, and that is generating a lot of data. So Facebook kind of has all that data under its control. Same goes with the Apple also. So in fact, there was one example how these dominant players are actually trying to stifle the competition in the economy. For example, Apple was promoting an app, and this was an app that gives control to the parents to limit the screen time of their children. So Apple started to promote an app even when a rival app for this was already existing. So Apple promoted its own app, and then it told that this rival app had some security issues. So it was not safe to be used. The rival app is not safe to be used, and people should rather use the app that the Apple has promoted. So because Apple has a dominant position in the market, people tend to believe that the rival app may actually be having some security issues, while the rival app may actually be extremely safe. It may not have any security issues, but because the Apple already has a dominant position in the market, people may tend to believe that Apple app is safe while the rival app is not safe to be used. So this way, Apple was stifling the competition with its rival app. This is one example of how the Apple was using or abusing the dominant position in the economy. And many of these companies, the tech giants, have also abused their dominant position by buying away their rivals. For example, Facebook bought WhatsApp, Facebook bought Instagram. So like that, they are buying out their rivals, and they are becoming more aggressive on their rivals by buying out these rivals. So this is another strategy that is used by these tech giants to stifle the competition and also to increase their dominance in the economy. So because of all these issues itself, the US House panel was set up, and the House panel questioned the chiefs of all of these big tech giants. And later on, it came out with a report, and it made some recommendations how these players can be tackled, and how it is possible to prevent them from abusing the dominant position in the market. So for that, the first thing it told was a structural separation. That is, each of these companies, for example, Google has so many it is actually doing so many things. So what the US House panel told was, there has to be a structural separation where there will be several smaller companies. So if rather than one big giant company, if there are a large number of smaller companies, then the kind of influence that it can have on the digital ecosystem will be lesser. So this is one way we can tackle their dominant position, is by having structural separation. That is, there is going to be a collection of smaller companies, and each of these will be having a lesser influence in the digital ecosystem. That is the first suggestion given by the House panel. The second is that the adjacent line of business. So if Apple is doing some business, then it must not be allowed to move on to an adjacent line of business, so that it is just expanding and expanding, and it has become a dominant player in the economy. So adjacent line of business should not be allowed. Third is presumptive prohibition. So where it is seen that a particular company is trying to merge and acquire some company just to stifle out competition, and just to make it is trying to buy out its rivals itself, then we have to prohibit such mergers and acquisitions. Recently, I just now I quoted the example of how Facebook acquired both WhatsApp as well as Instagram. So just because Facebook has that money power to buy out these rivals, it bought the rival companies, and it became more aggressive. So whenever we see that a particular tech giant is using its money power and dominant position to buy out the rivals and thereby stifle the competition in the economy, such mergers and acquisitions will have to be prohibited. So these are the three important recommendations given by the US House panel to tackle these big tech giants and to prevent them from abusing their dominant position. See what is the scenario in India. The first thing is that the Competition Commission had noted how if you search for a flight in the Google, then the first in the list to be shown is the Google's flight search, and after that you will find the other sites where we usually go and look for flights, but the first search will be the Google's flight details. So that is why Competition Commission held that Google was misusing its dominant position, and it was displaying its result first, and it was making its algorithms such that when we search for flights, then it is a Google's flight search that is going to be displayed first and later on the other sites. So that is how Google was misusing its position. Second, again, the Competition Commission noted regarding the misuse of dominant position, because what Google was doing is Google was trying to dictate several small mobile phone device manufacturers in India that whenever they are manufacturing the device itself, they must have several Google's own apps installed in it. So Google had the support of the Android. So many of these manufacturers, mobile phone device manufacturers, they were told by Google that these device manufacturers will have to install in the pre-manufacturing phase itself, they have to install these Google apps with the Android as the operating system. They have to install several Google apps, has to be pre-installed with the device manufacturing. So this was told by Google to many of the device manufacturers. For example, if you look at various Android phones that come in the market now, we see Google Chrome is already there, Gmail is already there. So these are some of the apps. YouTube is already there. So these are some of the apps which come pre-installed with the phone itself. So these manufacturers of the device are compelled by Google to install these Google apps before the device is manufactured. So this is again a classic example of abusing the dominant position in the market. So on this, the Competition Commission of India has already highlighted, and it has questioned Google about this thing. So this is the scenario in India. So if you want to write a way forward, like how to reduce the dominant position, abuse of dominant position by these, you can use the recommendations of the US House panel, what important 3 recommendations it gave. So you can write that in your way forward also, that this is how we can reduce the dominance that these players are now enjoying in the digital market. So that is it for today. And as we had discussed last week, that from this week we will be resuming the motivational quotes and also the questions. So today we'll have a look at the question that you have to write and prepare tomorrow. So the question is, analyze the impact of climate change on the distribution of flora and fauna. So it is a 15 marker question which has to be written with a good introduction, body and conclusion. The format has to be followed in 15 markers, and you have to build a base before you directly jump into the question. So it is not a 10 marker question where you directly start with the content of the answer. So you have to build a good base, and you also have to give a good space for your conclusion. So that is how a 15 marker question is to be written. So, and previously when we were discussing various 10 and 15 marker question, I would ask you to brainstorm at least, and then if you're not writing because you were busy preparing for prelims. So now that the prelims is over, but you have to write a full-fledged answer for every question that we discuss. So only that is going to benefit you. So if you think that tomorrow I'm going to discuss this question and you will note down the content, then that is never going to happen. Because the reason why we practice so many questions, we take up test series and we write answers to so many questions, is not because exactly these questions are going to come in the mains exam. That is not the goal. The goal is to have enough practice so that whatever surprise comes in your exam, you would have had enough practice that looking at the question, you are confident to frame an answer within 7 to 9 minutes. So if you're just thinking that tomorrow when I discuss you will write down the content, so you will prepare the topic like that, that is not going to happen, because eventually in the exam the same question is not going to come. You will have a different question posed by UPSC. The prelims paper that we saw today, that we saw last week, would have been a very good example for you, that no matter how many test series you solve, the UPSC paper is eventually going to be completely different. So that is going to happen even in the mains as well. The reason for the rigorous practice that we do through test series and answering the questions is to just brace yourself up and to be confident that you can tackle any kind of question thrown by UPSC. And that confidence is going to come only when you learn to face the questions and start writing answers to them. Just by listening to the discussion and then noting down the content and then memorizing it, thinking that if this question comes I will write everything, then that is not going to be possible. You have to train your brain to confront a question and then answer and tackle it beautifully. So for that you have to practice writing answers. So please do write the complete answer, not just the structure. So these were the other articles from Saturday and Monday, which weren't important from the exam point of view, or which we have already discussed previously. So that's it for today. Thank you.